Hello, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Dr. Lee Kaplan. In this episode, I sit down with Emily Contois to discuss her recently published article, Fueling Masculinity: How Ads for Plant-Based Burgers and Electric Trucks Reinforce Gender Norms and Resist Sustainable Imaginaries. We explore the politics of food, masculinity, consumer culture, and advertising. Drawing on her work in food studies, media studies, and public health, Contois examines how everyday objects, from Impossible Burgers to Ford F-150s, become powerful cultural symbols through which ideas about gender, identity, expertise, and citizenship are constructed and contested. Together, we discuss the hidden ideologies embedded in food marketing, the relationship between meat consumption and hegemonic masculinity, the rise of alternative proteins, the gendered history of dieting, and the surprising parallels between the advertising of electric vehicles and plant-based meat. Along the way, we explore concepts such as petromasculinity, food anxiety, carno-nostalgia, and the ways in which advertising simultaneously reflects and shapes our collective visions of the future. If you like what we do here, please subscribe at patreon.com/everythingisideology or give a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello and welcome back. I'm joined today by Emily Contois, who researches media within consumer culture, focusing on how identities are formed at the vital intersection of food, the body, and ideas about health. She's the author of Diners, Dudes, and Diets, great title, How Gender and Power Collide in Food, Media, and Culture, and it was published in 2020, and co-editor of Food Instagram, something many of us deal with and see all day. And the subtitle is Identity, Influence, and Negotiation. A richly interdisciplinary scholar, her academic work has been published in Advertising and Society Quarterly, American Studies, Feminist Media Studies, and Gastronomica, and Fat Studies, among others. She has also written for NBC News, Jezebel, and Nursing Clio. Been interviewed on podcasts such as The Sporkful, Gastropod, and Good Food, and appeared on CBS This Morning and Ugly Delicious on Netflix. She is Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa, where she also serves as faculty in residence. She holds a PhD and an MA in American Studies from Brown University, an MLA in Gastronomy from Boston University, and an MPH focused in public health nutrition from the University of California, Berkeley. So thanks so much for sitting down and kind of talking about this on our humble show and whatnot. So what you're getting at is something that we all know and feel on a very gestural level. And I say that almost as a pun, the gesture, like, digesting as well. And I think, so why don't we start with this? What is food studies? What are the ways of kind of discussing it and talking about it? And how does it break down? Because, like, even when you're introducing something like a field such as, like, sort of anthropology, there's a million different ways to study it. There's, like, looking at bones. There's looking at talking. There's looking at the development of language. There's looking at the development of the tongue. There's, like, all of these sorts of things. So by food studies, what are you particularly looking at here in this piece and in your overall work?
Yeah, so food studies is a relatively young discipline. We come out of the 1980s. It's sort of a discipline only as old as I am. And so I really like the way my friend Ali Alcon sort of describes the field of having three different threads. One focusing on food systems. So those folks would bring in political economy. They could bring in something like agrarian sociology. They could be thinking about systems and all the players and steps within it in a lot of robust different ways. Then there's also the really important thread of food justice, thinking about how food is accessible or not in equitable and equitable ways all throughout our global, very complicated food system. And then there are those of us who do sort of like food and culture. So that's a little bit more where I reside, thinking about things like media representations, thinking about daily life, thinking about the everyday sort of experience with food. So there are definitely, a moment in the field where there are lots of kind of boring, single commodity histories, and that's how people we're bringing about sort of studies of food. But I think the most interesting way to think about food studies is like you get to use food as a lens for these other complicated processes that you're interested in, and that food opens it up. And so when you think about it from a pedagogical perspective, food is so incredible to teach with because we all have to eat, we all have experience with it, we all have big opinions that bring people to it in a really exciting way. Food brings in lots of different audiences to academic work as well. So it's a fun field. And so for me, you listed off my whole, biography. And so I've, come at it from sort of the medical public health side of how do we think about what people eat and how do we create truly healthy, equitable food environments for everybody. I've studied it from this gastronomic, food history, food culture, food media side. And then American studies meant that I got to situate all of that within American cultural history, within the history of medicine and public health, within women's gender and sexuality studies, and then within media and consumer culture. So it's already a richly interdisciplinary field. And then my own training has definitely leaned into making it as complicated interdisciplinary as possible.
That's great. And there's something about food that makes it automatically inherently interdisciplinary because when you're thinking about food, you always already have to think about who's eating it, who's consuming it, where is it coming from, the history, the time period, et cetera, et cetera. So many people get into thinking about sort of like food and indigenous histories and all of these different sorts of things as well. And doing philosophy or thought with something in our everyday life makes me think of kind of like Sartre thinking about phenomenology. He
Yeah,
like picked up
absolutely.
exactly. He like picked up like a glass of whatever crazy drink he was drinking and said, this is phenomenology. We could do philosophy with this, looking at this, the experience of it, et cetera, et cetera. Um,
Absolutely. One of my PhD students just defended an incredible dissertation on the politics of the ordinary in the American supermarket. So, absolutely, food gives us really smart ways into a lot of these classical disciplines as well.
Yeah, of course. And there's so many aspects of it in which it works so usefully, as you mentioned, as a pedagogical tool, in which it brings students in. There's something connected to memory, there's something connected to place, there's something connected to sort of consumption. And within all of this, you said the politics of the ordinary. Well, the ordinary is where much of the ideology sort of lies. When it becomes kind of like an everydayness, it becomes reproduced in such a way that it kind of makes it so that these things are naturalized, and this is some of the stuff you get into talking about. So, what are some of the hidden sort of components in food production that we don't necessarily think about or see in terms of sort of advertising? What you're looking at? How does meat become masculine? And
Ah, so the piece that we're talking about is this article that I wrote that was really interested in looking at how meat is imagined in American culture and how it's running in parallel with how we think about automobility and particularly like driving trucks. And so thinking about how something like what we would call hegemonic masculinity, right? Our culture's dominant way at a particular time period of defining and performing what masculinity supposedly is. And so meat has been a big part of that in Western cultures for a long time, related to animals, related to hunting, to ideas about the caveman and caveman diets. And we see all of these ideas still circulate. But what I was interested in looking at is like, well, then what happens when brands try to market an alternative meat product? So I'm looking at the Impossible Burger. And then what happens when we're trying to have these electric vehicles come in? And so what happens when the Ford F-150, which I was sort of startled to learn is not just the best-selling truck in the United States, it has been the best-selling vehicle for the last 40 years. And so thinking about the ordinary, thinking about common, really common aspects of our lives, like hamburgers and trucks are so incredibly ordinary. In imagining, what American life is, and then, because you go where the academic job market takes you, for me living in Oklahoma, these are incredibly resonant symbols in a regional sense too. And so moving on from the trucks, what happens when Ford tries to come up with their F-150 Lightning, this electric truck? So I'm interested in how the advertising for these two products that are actually quite similar in how they talk about masculinity and how they imagine an idea of America are quite similar in the kinds of norms they're upholding and the kinds of worlds they imagine for us. And so advertising, I mean, I think of it as like the language of our consumer culture, that even as traditional advertising becomes much less prominent. The Super Bowl is one of the only moments, right, where the traditional television commercial, has some sort of cultural heft. But advertising as this commercial element of a consumer culture that largely, orchestrates itself through ideas of like that consumerism is how you exercise your civic responsibility in this country in so many ways. You hear phrases like eat with your fork, or sustainability efforts being about buying particular kinds of products, like switching to an electric vehicle, that these are consumer solutions to these big problems we face that are far more complicated than that.
Right. No, that's great. Thank you. And by reducing like the human unit to just the level of consumption, it kind of makes it so that we are buying a product, and the product kind of defines who we are in different ways and defines our lifestyles and creates our subjectivities. And what's in the commercial dictates kind of like our own unconscious desires and screen memories of things and whatnot. But also by reducing the human to just kind of a consumer, it doesn't necessarily care about the human because the human disappears in a way, and the human just becomes a thing of consumption, which kind of gets rid of the idea of caring for that human. And a lot of your work looks at what if we had a sort of ethics of care or feminist ethics of care undergirding our food systems, undergirding our responsibilities and social responsibilities, because that would create a sort of like more equitable future, but as well stop us from eating junk and caring about ourselves and caring about our bodies in different ways. Um, so you get to sort of different kind of ways of in your conclusion, you kind of get to ways of imagining different food futures. But you start the piece by kind of talking about food anxieties and how these food anxieties stretch back centuries. Can you talk about food anxieties and kind of what this means and is trying to get at?
Yeah, so there's two things here. One is like some people come to food studies enamored by how food brings us together, right? Things like commensality of this social bond that is formed when we break bread together, the way that a food culture comes to define various aspects of identity, whether it's gender or ethnicity or ideas of the nation. But this idea of like how food is paradoxical, is contradictory, and is full of anxiety was one of the ways that I came to food studies. Like I was actually interested in studying diet culture, when I was a young scholar, writing my honors thesis in undergrad. How could you understand a national identity and its, gendered sort of implications by understanding how the foods that people tried so hard to limit and avoid? And so by studying dieting, you could actually learn quite a lot about the American character, the American history, the American people. So that's one aspect of it, of thinking about how this idea of anxiety comes into it. But the way that I'm starting this piece is quoting Warren Belasco, who's an incredible mentor of mine, who's very fondly referred to as the grandfather of food studies for the work that he's done, building up this field. And he's written this incredible book that's called subtitle of his book is like The History of the Future of Food, which is kind of like a mind trick for yourself of like, what? But to make the point that we've been quite anxious about what are we going to eat in the future for a very long time. And so he's looking at world fairs and how they've been representing these ideas about the future of food and how it intervenes with technology, but also, as he points out, this idea of not just what are we going to eat and is it going to be enough for everyone, but are those in positions of power, namely white Anglo men, going to be able to eat meat? Is meat going to be accessible? Is this way of eating that's come to be understood as affluent and satisfying and nutritionally rich? We're in a moment right now where we're, frantic about protein all over again. And so that's a piece of this meat story. But that's where I'm interested in thinking about how these concerns we have about the future of food and how we will navigate it. And, will our future be delicious? Will it be equitable? Will it be all these things we want it to be? To realize we are not alone in worrying about those things. They've been with us for hundreds of years.
Yeah, of course. That's great. I mean, so many different things come to mind, even just like simple stuff, kind of, as you said, doing kind of thought experiments and whatnot, how gender works and kind of the everyday. A lot of these spectacles that we go to are very subtly gendered. Like if you go to sort of like a medieval times, there's all of these different things going on with like the meat and the sort of expectations, and then the king and then the queen and the crown. Like all of these various things reinforce a politics of sort of like normal, quote unquote, this type of kind of heteronormative normalcy that's grounded in kind of like the idea of eating meat. And I mean, there's so many aspects of food that kind of lend themselves to history in different ways.
Yeah.
What's
And it's not
grown,
just the
how it's grown.
food. Yeah, it's not just that it's
Exactly.
meat, right? It's everything from ingredients, texture, plating, portion size, ideas about appetite, how eating relates to our bodies, like consumption being this really important intermediary step, not just as sort of consumer desire, but also like actual consumption and bodies. And then all these ideas about ideal bodies, what they're supposed to look like, how they're supposed to move through the world, what work they're supposed to be able to accomplish. That food gives us a million and one different ways into all of that.
Yeah, very much so. And when you were studying diets and diet culture and whatnot, there's also this classic sort of thing of like balancing this sort of excess that we all want with restraint. And it gets into very sort of Catholic and or Christian kind of ethics and mentalities and whatnot. But what that brought to mind was I saw a while ago this fun sort of thing being shared where it was the wine diet. It was like the wine and steak diet. Did you ever see that?
I
It was
missed that one, luckily.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Well, I wasn't spared that, but it was this diet. I think it was in like Vogue magazine or something in the 1960s. One of these sort of classic, kind of you should be this way or you should be fit or kind of like you should be this way for your husband, et cetera, et cetera. But the diet was, as you could tell, it was like eating. It was like consuming a certain amount of wine, a certain amount of eggs, and a certain amount of steak, and you had to like and the people tried it. I saw this whole like Reddit thread of people trying like the wine and steak diet, and everyone was like, "I'm hungover. I feel horrible." Like, but this was a very big thing and big enough to be in Vogue magazine. And it's kind of funny the ways in which this kind of happens because over time, it's obviously ridiculous. It's silly. It's nonsensical. You're not going to feel great, but it's weird because in this way, it counteracts and it's a sort of subversive kind of diet in a weird way just because it has steak and meat consumption within the diet, and that doesn't seem to be kind of like the dainty like sort of feminine eating practice where you go to a restaurant and like you're on a date and like you get the salad or whatever it is. Like, so I thought it was really interesting that this specifically included steak as part of it. But I guess it was counteracted by like the femininity of the wine or something like this. But this is all to say, how does food become gendered?
Well, this is what's so funny, right? Like, of course, food isn't like inherently or naturally or essentially gendered in any way. And so I think it makes it a really easy object to teach people about this whole idea of like the social and cultural construction of gender. Food come to be understood as feminine and dainty, or sturdy and hardy and masculine. And so I think the dichotomy of like the masculine steak and the feminine salad is largely a 19th century phenomenon from the work of other historians, sort of looking at the moment in which women are able to navigate public spaces on their own in different ways, and what that has to do with restaurant culture. And so the salad on the menu like is actually like a piece of that very specific history. But to think about why do those foods connote that idea of gender now, it's a part through this incredible repetition that our media and commercial, advertising environment makes possible, that message is repeated over and over and over again. And so one other article that I worked on was looking at, how salads were promoted in like Men's Health versus Health for Women, these different magazines that had these really gender targeted audiences. And so for women, salads were all about pursuing lack, that it was a salad had as few calories as possible, that you're trying to just consume like the least amount of calories. Late 1990s, early 2000s is a moment of like negative calorie lore. The idea that if you eat something that has like so much fiber and so much water that by the time your body's done digesting it, you've burned calories. So thinking about, how overt our diet culture used to be, like now it comes in a slightly different lifestyle sort of wellness shape. So if that's salads for women, like salads for men from like a Men's Health kind of promotion, was what power bowls became, that they had lots of protein added to them, whether it was meat or beans or, a low-fat cheese, that they were about what was in them And like nutritional science was a way to sort of masculinize all of this content of like what was being added to make a salad enough for a man's appetite and a man's needs. But like a salad is a salad. And so looking at how things like the way nutrition science is talked about, the way the particular macronutrients are focused upon, how we shoot them, how the salads were even displayed differently in different kinds of bowls. Do you show people eating them or not? All these different ways, like ideas about gender, even with the salad, is sort of presented. And so one idea that I worked a lot with in my first book, Diners, Dudes, and Diets, was what another marketing scholar had worked with called gender contamination. The idea that particularly straight heterosexual men are going to have trouble with consumer items that are perceived as feminine. For them to consume them is viewed as feminizing, it's viewed as losing status, that it's something that men are going to resist. And so there are these many moments where when a feminized kind of food product, so in my book, I'm looking at things like Weight Watchers, I'm looking at yogurts, I'm looking at diet sodas, cookbooks, food television, right? Like all these different food phenomena being marketed to men, that part of how they do it is have to navigate this idea of masculinity, being decreased or impinged upon by having to engage in these sort of feminine practices. So that's another way where this gets even more complicated. It's not just repeating these ideas of feminine or supposedly masculine norms, but being able to navigate the idea of it being sort of at risk. And so with masculinity in the ideas of whether it's fragile or always in crisis, there's lots of different ways we can talk about masculinity that way. But that becomes a piece of how the marketing and the advertising works for sure.
Yeah, totally. And this is reproduced again in just like really subtle ways in kind of movies or everyday life where it's just like
Absolutely.
my wife is out, so now I'm gonna have the pasta and the pizza because the wife is like watching my health in some way and she's like the gatekeeper, the quote unquote
Yes, absolutely. This idea of the
food
woman
ball and
being
chain sort of
responsibility.
thing.
Yes. Hmm.
And this also connects to sort of like weird right wing discourse on like soy. And instead of looking at like actual sort of issues and systemic issues that are creating the conditions for like a deprived living situation, they're like blaming it on like sort of gendering food items like soy and creating like a boogeyman target sort of thing. And it makes things understandable to an audience that doesn't care to understand. And it makes these narratives become consumable as well. And consuming seems to be very much like a food studies trope, but you also see it in imperial discourse. So who has food, what is eaten, what is consumed. And I was also thinking when you were kind of getting into the lack that's in the female diet, it made me think of potentially, like, you could correct me here, a dialectical situation in which sort of the less a female eats, the more she satisfies a sort of like male gaze or like sort of the male desire. So like the fullness becomes displaced onto the other. So like the less you do, the more you receive in some kind of like weird twisted manner, perhaps. You could say something about that. I also wanted to jump in and just talk about really quickly the nutritional science aspect of it and how sometimes science is utilized to target sort of like masculine to kind of like make it science is used for hegemonic masculinity purposes in some cases, but then science is completely dismissed in other cases to play
Which we see
into
in
a
this
hegemonic
article. Yeah.
masculinity. So if you wanted to touch on any of the crazy stuff I just mentioned, please feel free.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything from, how like pre-workout is marketed, right? With like little molecules, being depicted on labels. Like this idea of capital S science having this masculine power as different products are marketed to men, particularly things that might be read as kind of diet culture-y, but then can be, resignified really as these sort of masculine wellness sort of ambitions. But I think the way science actually comes up in the article that we're talking about is like climate science and how it relates to sort of these different nutritional aspects that science is really pushed to the side and sort of made fun of and downplayed. I think one of the Impossible Burger ads that I analyze, literally has, language in it to the effect of, well, do we really care what those nerds think, about, climate crisis or greenhouse gases or whatever? And then a beat later, it's like, yes, we do, right? And then it gives you, a little bit of the pitch of how Impossible Burger is is promoting or is contributing, right, to a slightly more sustainable food environment. But there's a way of like dismissing it, making light of it, using humor so that it's not so serious, not so heavy, is an interesting way that science and expertise more broadly is sort of being downplayed in these ads. And so that role of expertise is definitely something we see being manipulated and downplayed, particularly throughout our social media environment. Sources for health information about medicine, ideas about food and nutrition. But we also see it, in the space of the influencer versus the old school food critic who operates with journalistic ethics and, goes to a restaurant multiple times and, has expertise and experience that they're lending to their food reviews versus the everyday person doing the front-facing camera stuff from the front of their car. So we definitely see these ideas about expertise, about training, about science playing a role in how people think about their food environments and what's good and right and moral and nutritious and good, for them to eat.
Yeah, no, that's great. And kind of part of that is also the distrust. It already plays on kind of the distrust of experts and dismissing people and dismissing things. So that's kind of part of this like underlying cynicism that these kind of commercials play in different ways. They don't change the role and the ways in which we consume, but rather they continue consumption with adding another element of that consumption where the plant becomes another meat. And I thought this is a really interesting and sort of profound idea and take. So I was hoping you'd say something about kind of the problem of posing the plant as another form of meat. But also it does some good work as well, but it also just simply reproduces the logics of kind of climate destruction by marketing it as such.
No, exactly. So if we accept the scientific finding that what we eat contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and to our overall situation with climate crisis, the necessary changes that we would have to do to alter what we eat is a recommendation mostly to eat less meat, given the resources involved, that to be able to grow them, to transport them, on and on. Like meat is much more of a contributor than beans or even, eggs, something that still comes from an animal but isn't meat. But American consumer culture and also American culture more broadly very rarely puts forward an eat less, consume less kind of a message. And so in our longstanding food culture, like it really hasn't been since World War II rationing that people were expected to give up, whether it was butter or wheat or, whatever food ingredient it was, that for, the home front, everyday person's contribution was to give up those things during the time of war. But it was always also with this promise that there was going to be this consumer bonanza, right, when the war was over, and that we were going to be able to consume so much. And so as we think about what actually happens with the rise of suburbs and how that way of life is made available, particularly to white families, the way we remember that post-war moment is very much this consumer bonanza of, consuming a ton and having that come to define an idea of what America was, and an America that's ascendant, throughout sort of the 20th century. And so this idea of eating less or eating differently or having to make a compromise hasn't been a part of American food culture for a really long time. And so for there to be this need that if we're going to influence climate change on an individual consumer basis, changing what you eat is one way to actually get about that. But instead of eating meat less often or eating meat very rarely, like as a treat, instead we've seen the rise of an entire new sector in the food industry to create alternative meats that you can just eat more of this other product. And so counterintuitively, like we're seeing more and more people try alternative meat products, but they're also still eating meat. Like meat consumption is still on the rise, like not just in China, where economics and life has been changing, but like in the United States, continuing to just eat more and more meat. And so it's actually another author who came up with the idea that plants is just becoming like the fourth meat, that it's just one more consumer product that's available, and that we're just eating more and more. We're not actually making any changes to consume less, which is ultimately what we would need to do, not just to influence sort of where we're at with climate crisis, but to be able to get out of some of the traps that living in such a voracious consumer culture has gotten us into. But that's very hard for advertising to market, right? Like I think the part of my thinking with this piece came out of this really cool conference I got to go to that was specifically about like green advertising and sustainability and the role of the advertising industry in these issues. And so they love to point to Patagonia, which has a pretty good track record of making quality products that last a long time. These issues of like planned obsolescence are less of a problem. And they have this very famous ad of like, don't buy this jacket. Like it's literally an anti-consumption ad. But it is so successful and leads to greater sales because of how it resonates with a particular kind of consumer, right? Who wants to think of themselves as an enlightened consumer, who cares about the earth and who cares about the kind of consumer culture that they're practicing and how they navigate all of that as a part of status, as a part of identity, as a part of also trying to be a responsible consumer citizen. And so I do find that tension just ongoingly very, very fascinating, of this desire to consume and constrain that animates these ideas that are particularly about diet culture, but also this broader, not just metaphor, but like actual practice and way of life for living in an American consumer culture. And so this question of like alternative meat products navigates through this in a really interesting way. And so then they don't even want to call themselves something that's a sustainable food product. Like, nope, we're just meat. In part because men have been shown, right, to be more resistant to these sustainable behaviors, whether it's using less water in the shower, driving a fuel-efficient vehicle, things like, wearing a mask during the pandemic, getting vaccines, all of these things. We have lower rates of men ascribing to whether they're health behaviors or environmental, eco-conscious behaviors, that these norms about what masculinity is, about what a real man is and does and acts, that green behaviors are up against a big challenge of like how American culture imagines men and encourages them to act.
That's great. Yeah, I would actually love to see a commercial or the food industry or something based around what's considered kind of female desires from maybe different points of view. Like, what would that look like too? Because by only advertising to men in many different ways, and particularly usually white men, as you point out, it's sort of like missing most or half of society as well. Kind of like what comes to mind is like women hold up half of the sky, the mouthing, right? So it's sort of like, um, they're missing a huge constituent of people that eat food as well. So it kind of seems to me that it goes against the logic of capital to just advertise to one segment of the population. And especially because so many of these things, advertising to men just kind of makes it so that it's a destructive force in many different ways, because of hegemonic masculinity is just a force of destruction in so many different ways. And food systems are just one part of that extractive destruction that occurs. And you see that happening in so many different ways. Even in these commercials to occur, there's so much death that needs to happen to create these products. And who knows with Impossible Burgers, if it takes like large amounts of sort of soil and large amounts of energies and sources to even create some of these things, right? So sometimes, like a lot of companies can kind of greenwash in different ways, which we see kind of happening a lot and being critiqued. And this idea of kind of dieting made me think of like, there's this weird thing where like if you go to Barnes and Noble, um, if you go to the philosophy section, you see just a bunch of stoicism stuff. And you just see a bunch of like kind of trying to master the self, whatever that means or looks like. And kind of like the self becomes a project to work on, another identity or brand to be formed and shaped. And so when I think of dieting culture, I sort of also think of this weird turn towards stoicism, which also intersects as with like hegemonic forms of masculinity, where it's like denying emotionality, denying so many forms of selfhood. So there's these weird aspects of kind of like also dieting for men is a particularly fascinating thing as well.
Oh,
Um,
it is.
yeah. So I was wondering, I guess, if you could maybe, this is not in your sort of article. We'll get back to it because I want to start talking a little bit about the cars and the car situation. But if you could kind of say a little bit about, if you don't mind, like dieting for men, what's going on there?
Yeah, so the story that I'm tracking in my book is the commercial diet industry. So Weight Watchers, Nutrisystem, Jenny Craig, how they attempt to market themselves to men in sort of the mid-aughts into the 20 teens. And so they have a really hard time because they're trying to sell the same product, but in distinctly gendered ways to women versus to men. And so when we think about like how does something come to be gendered, like one paper that I wrote was literally taking these 60-second animated videos that was how does it work for Weight Watchers Online for women and Weight Watchers Online for men. And you see how they talk about the same tools, the same approach in totally different ways. And part of it is that for men, you're just going to track what you eat and the weight's going to come off. You don't have to change what you eat. You don't have to actually embody that body discipline or that dietary restraint. Your masculine appetite is still going to be satisfied, that you're going to eat real food and you're going to feel great and the weight is just going to fall off and you're going to run half marathons and men are going to respect you and like everything is going to be great. Well, for women, it's this much more traditional story of self-transformation, of adhering to, particular dietary rules, of eating things, that have less calories, that are healthy, of cooking, of doing lots of thinking work when you're in the grocery store, that was very, very gendered in every possible way as they tried to market it. And so, of course, these programs aren't particularly popular with men. They don't make lots and lots of inroads. But what's been fascinating is looking at how men's wellness, particularly within this social media space, has been able to codify essentially the diet culture that women have been navigating for, decades, like very, very similarly. But it's packaged in these terms that are then appropriately masculine. So whether we're talking about macros instead of talking about a diet plan, it's very often couched in the terms of fitness, that is about building muscle, about working out. It's not about losing weight, right? It's always about losing fat, which is very different. The language and sort of the philosophy behind like what's actually being changed, what are you embarking upon, and this idea of control, right? Control of the self, control of appetite, control of results, that definitely plays out within diet culture for both men and women, but has different ramifications when we think about the demands and expectations of hegemonic masculinity. So men are not going to go to a diet group like Weight Watchers and talk about their feelings and, navigate their way through that. But we are seeing really similar ways. The New York Times reached out to me when they were doing a piece on Ozempic, going after men. And so their sort of catchy title was calling it Brozempic, like what happens when GLP-1s, are advertising directly to men about these pharmaceutical drugs and this effort to lose weight. And it repeats exactly what Weight Watchers tried to do, right? You make it about fitness, you lose particular types of colors, you speak to men in very different terms than you would to women about what weight loss is, about what their goals are, about what the transformation is even about. And so I think one of the things you might find interesting, like getting at this philosophy piece, is like when I did this side-by-side comparison, like I felt incredibly ambivalent about the fact that like I don't think it's a good thing, right, for this very overt diet culture messaging to now also be targeting men, right, for men to have to suffer in the way that women have for many decades, and being, happy in their, attempting to be happy in your sense of self and how it's related to these ideas about the body. But for women, when they talk about weight loss in these traditional ways, there is this promise of transformation. And it's a destructive one in a way, right? That like you're going to be a better woman, a better wife, like a better everything, right? That is what is on the other side of this work to lose weight, change your diet, work out. And there's someone else on the other side. For men to keep that cool distance from the work of weight loss and to codify it in different terms, there is also no promise of transformation. You're just going to lose the weight and be who you already are and we're always supposed to be. And so in that way, think about these limits of masculinity and how hegemonic doesn't make space for emotion, for male relationships with one another, like all these ways that it constricts, like weight loss and how it was talked about, like also doesn't offer up this more expansive way of thinking about the body and the self and the relationship to it. That is, of course, mediated with these unreasonable ideals, right? Like it was a really complicated thing to tease out. But I think it is still a piece of this, that even though there's a lot of discourse now on social media about weight loss to men, it's just in different words, different terms, that it isn't about health. It isn't about self-actualization. It isn't about balance. It isn't about moderation. Like it's still this very, very extreme messaging about controlling the body, controlling the self, and becoming something.
Very cool. Thank you for that. It's super insightful. It made me think that there's this like interesting mapping going on where sort of like where the spirit and the physical are mapped onto like different gender dynamics when it comes to working out. So there's this spiritual transformation happening when like a woman goes on a diet. She sort of like has to do all of these things and think there's something about spiritual transformation where just the man during their diet phase, it's like, you're already good enough. You've got a great personality. You're going to get all the ladies. You already got all the ladies, but you just need to lose some weight in different ways. And I also think that there's something about sort of like fatness that includes an aspect of judgment. Sort of like when you see a heavier set person or something, it's seen as a moral failing and whatnot. So this seems to be happening, I think, particularly for women. It seems like something like it's your fault, or there's some moral failing, or there's something like undesirable inherently about your personality or quality. Like this makes me think of like Roland Barthes has this piece basically on wrestling where he's just like the caricature, like the type of face, like having a big nose and looking evil, remind like there's no separation between like the character, the personality trait, and the physical signifier. And there's something like that's happening with the body as well. And here also you see with Ozempic, like this Brozempic thing, the times in a lot of other sort of journalistic enterprises are really like pun
Yes.
manufacturing machines. Um, it made me think of also using science to propose and repurpose another form of hegemonic masculinity, where you let science do the work for you as well. Like you're a man, you shouldn't have to do all this work. Like life is already hard enough. Whereas women, like it's dieting is another aspect of like unseen labor that's done in many different ways. Sometimes for the self, sometimes not for the self, sometimes for a mixture of both. But here, it's like men are already good enough, and here, just take this shot. Why do that dieting stuff? Just go work out. And there's something really gay also about just like workout culture and bro culture. Like dudes filming themselves like working out. Like there's something very homoerotic about that, and also like making sure it looks good and having the right filter. Like there's something also very gay going on here as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean,
so
that's literally the history of fitness culture, right? Like it starts as a gay male fitness phenomenon to work on the body and particularly to craft muscles in that particular kind of way. It's not mainstream in any way, from late 19th century, like into sort of mid, 20th century. Like it really is Arnold Schwarzenegger who heterosexualizes this working on the body. And we're now living through a moment where so many of those incredibly marginalized body practices of professional bodybuilding have trickled down to everyday people, from excessive hydration to creatine supplementation, freaking out about protein, that these are all things that came out of this athletic subculture that was so far on the margins and now is like smack dab in the middle of not just fitness culture, but this broader American way of conceiving of the body and how you're supposed to care for it and train it.
totally. I mean, you see that directly too happening with like sort of peak head Seth being like, no one in the military should be fat, whatever that means. Meanwhile, like everyone's having Diet Cokes and inviting football teams and eating Big Macs and all of these other things. And Big Macs sort of come to represent this idea of a particular form of America, getting it quickly, quote unquote, so-called ingenuity, all of these things. So you see this happening very directly on the level of kind of overt politics too. Um, but I was hoping that we could also transition into how this works in the car industry as well. And get into some of the commercials and kind of also there's moments in the piece where you have meat and trucks overlap as well. And there's something about kind of the family structure. So I was hoping if you wouldn't mind saying something about trucks, and then getting into some of the commercials you look at and analyze, and then we can move on like, what is the family doing here? Like, what is the role of the family within this?
For sure. So I think the parallel tracks of thinking about meat and food. And then this idea of like automobility and trucks is one historically contingent phenomenon, that the rise of industrial agriculture, industrial livestock production is happening at the same time that we're literally building roads, railroads, and developing a transportation system in the United States that is going to privilege sort of the individual car, and the idea of like the autonomous individual who can always get behind the wheel and look out at the open road and have that complete control of their destiny. So it brings in like ideas of the American West and manifest destiny, which of course have these violent imperial sort of undertones as well. But this idea of like a dominant identity, that the car and then the truck as, you know, a particular kind of vehicle navigates these ideas about what America is, about what our future should be, but also these ideas about masculinity that map onto ideas about the West and rural life. And so the truck is interesting as a mechanical, industrial, modern interpretation of the workhorse, which was, you know, this sturdy animal, you know, who could work the land, work hard, was very, very reliable. And so as the tractor and the truck become the new implements of managing rural life and agricultural spaces, like the truck comes to take on these ideas that were once an animal, but were a part of this labor system. And so the truck manages to connote like this really complicated set of symbols, stories, and histories of what trucks mean and what it means to be able to get behind the wheel and go where you want to go. And so I was inspired by a couple of different scholars and how they were thinking about how different kinds of masculinities are represented in advertising for cars, sometimes for trucks, but for all kinds of vehicles. And so thinking about how things like the fact that the most car commercials represent men as this sole driver with no passengers behind the wheel, driving really fast, you know, with incredible precision. You know, often there's that, you know, white language at the bottom saying this was done on a controlled course. Like none of you should go out and drive like this. That there's always this risk, this danger, this power that's a part of how a car is put through its paces and represented to us in an advertising, whether it's, you know, print or a commercial, a social media post, that it's always communicating these particular ideas about a kind of masculinity. But to get your questions about family and history, Kara Daggett does this really great job thinking about this concept of petromasculinity. So this idea that masculinity is tied to fossil fuel consumption and not limiting that in any way. So for me, it echoes some of the work that I've done thinking about masculine appetite, right? That it's not supposed to be constrained. It's not supposed to be channeled into a salad when what it wants is meat and potatoes. That this idea of petromasculinity kind of taps into those kinds of norms as well, but channels them into the consumption of fossil fuels and then the actions of driving the car. But then she also does this great work of like historicizing that, of thinking about petronostalgia, arguing that this rise of the American suburb in the post-war period, the rise of multiple, you know, two cars being owned in a family, and this ideal of it's very, very tied into these conventional ideas about what masculinity is, of like the man who is the breadwinner, who is the head of the family, and who gets in that car and consumes fuel and, you know, leaves the domestic realm to go off and, you know, perform the work that then supports this entire idea of the American family in this very nostalgic package of this post-war affluent consumer moment. Of course, this is incredibly white and incredibly straight and all of those things too. And so I was really inspired by how she's thinking about petronostalgia. And I see really similar things of how we think about, like, how does meat and masculinity come to be bound together in ways that feel so inextricable, even though we know it's constructed. And so there are also these post-war moments where very binary gender norms, you know, come to be bound to ideas about the home, thinking about the American kitchen, all of the appliances within it, the cookbooks, all the fashion culture that comes out. If you think of like Leave It to Beaver, right? And sort of the mom with the pearls and the apron, like when people think about a model of like what is femininity, that's often what some people imagine in their mind. And so this carno-nostalgia lies over and is, you know, wedded into these very similar norms around family, around the home, and around cars, and how it makes the suburb and its relationship to urban environments, to the rural environment, experiment, that by thinking about cars and meat together, it was able to sort of bring concepts from one sort of area of cultural studies and apply them to another and think about what are the connections across these various spaces. And then how does that get manipulated when you're trying to instead market an alternative, meat product and say, this is still meat, it's an animal, it's not a plant, and that this truck, right, is still powerful and about strength. It's about the cowboy, it's about the West, it's about everything that it has, symbolized and spoken to for so long that like none of that has to go away. We're just going to change it and make it a different fuel source.
Yeah, no, that's great, and it continues the same logics of overproduction and
Hmm.
destruction in many, many different ways, right? But it was interesting when I read the idea of the kind of workhorse you're getting at. I thought of it as a kind of specter of slavery in different ways, like the workhorse being like another version of the slave, a new version, and the workhorse is something that we don't think about. It conditions the existence for physical labor, and it's the thing that's created upon and with, and it's the unspoken kind of thing that conditions the America, like our area, our in North America specifically. Um, and I was thinking like one of the original sort of lots of the foundational moments of getting the land and whatnot was destroying a lot of the meat surplus and the meat products and whatnot, specifically in the form of buffalo. Um, so by killing and getting rid of buffaloes, it actually severed ties to the land, to different indigenous practices and whatnot in many different areas of what would now be America. So there's also this idea of getting rid of and shooting and eating and mastery over not just the land and animal, but also over other sort of indigenous cultures and whatnot as well. So if you want to get rid of a population, you cut it off at the food source as well. And then by consuming that, you're kind of also showing mastery over that other culture as well. Like you're taking their thing that sustains them to sustain yourself now, which is kind of like a food genocide in many different ways. That's kind of happening. So there's this that those were really excellent hermeneutical tools for kind of thinking through the logics of what's happening here. And you coined that term, so it's always great to kind of like shout out the thing that you coined. It's super helpful, really cool. But there's this other thing at work within these commercials that you point out, and that's I think you called it gay. Well, you or someone
It's a
called
different
it
concept.
gay
Yeah,
window
gay
dressing.
window dressing. It's sort of ugh, I don't think this is a practice, like, is actually done as sort of representations of sexuality anymore. It was sort of like in the 80s and 90s, particularly with fashion brands. And so it was the idea that you could represent people in advertising for products that looked androgynous, so they could be read by different audiences as either straight or gay. So it was a way for a brand to speak to multiple audiences, but without taking any sort of a political stance around inclusion or representation or anything like that. It was just a way to speak to more audiences at the same time. And so it was actually a colleague who read a draft of this paper, and she's like, I wonder if you could apply that in thinking about how these brands are attempting to talk about, or like as they're marketing these quote unquote sustainable products, but they're not marking them that way, right? They're not making a specific ad for Pride Month that's the rainbow and is at least making some sort of a representational commitment to the LGBTQ plus community. In this way, these brands aren't taking a stand to say something loud and proud about eco-consciousness, but they are representing it in a way that you can read a bit of both. So it's a way that these brands can appeal to different political persuasions when it comes to their consumers, without offending one or the other, that they can not take any political stand, but be putting forth a message that could be read in both ways by these different audiences. So it's very weak sauce, right? Of like a way to sort of approach this. But it's like very real, because like gay window dressing did nothing. Rainbow washing was something like many of us, right, we're very, very critical of. But we're now in a moment where there are hardly any brands who will say anything overt about the LGBTQ plus community, right? Like we just started Pride Month. Like there will be very few brand activations anymore. We're in a very different space. And so it's not to say that actually like did anything huge to change, the actual lives of people, but it was something, right? It wasn't enough. It wasn't, but it was something. And so it's like, oh, so this is similar, right? Like we're not even talking about sustainability. We're not even talking about inclusion. It's just, it's gone now. So it's part of what I see in these ads, that there is no stance. There is no loud message. There is no inspiring representation of what a future could look like that is sustainable, that gets us out of what's become this default of imagining life, that it involves meat and it involves cars. And it's very hard for people to imagine something beyond that. And so, of course, advertising is always trying to sell stuff. It's always trying to move product. That's what it does. But it could also at least imagine for us. It could represent what it could be like. That could plant some seeds as people imagine like what this could be and how we could live differently. But they're not even doing that.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of neoliberal sort of like logics makes it so that what has already sold will sell again. So why redo it, right? It's the whole like we have a million different, I don't know, let's say what movie do we have a million? We have a million Shreks, right? We can't imagine a world in which there's no Shrek or something, much in the same way it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism or something. It's like that sort of thing that's happening. And it's interesting because right now you're absolutely right. Like at least there was kind of even the discourse was just representational and kind of there was no meat to it as we see it, but at least there was kind of something to grasp, to hold on to imagine, to hope in different ways. Um, so can you talk a little bit about the ways in which kind of the electric truck was being sold? Um, and also, there was this other aspect of your piece where you kind of talk about the circumstances surrounding the context of where it was advertised and how. So there's like different advertisements for different sectors of the population as well. Like this is very clear when it comes to sort of politically engaged marketing. Like certain politicians would say certain things depending on like where they're running advertisements or something. So the food industry obviously uses a lot of these same logistical tools to kind of come up with how to market stuff in different ways to different populations. So they're not going to make that like nerd joke in other contexts or something like this, right? So yeah, if you wouldn't mind saying something about sort of like where these things were advertised and also how.
Yeah, so I took a very traditional approach of like analyzing things that were these classic sort of 30-second, 60-second ads, that classic sort of TV commercial length that lends itself to storytelling, which is part of what these brands had to do when they were new. They're trying to explain what they are to consumers, particularly skeptical ones, and then try, right, to imagine and present something that they'll want to be a part of. And so two of the ads were positioned in moments where they were trying to get that mass audience that is so incredibly rare. Like the Super Bowl is literally our last remaining mass culture in this country, when millions of people of a lot of different backgrounds tune in at the same time to the same thing and create those sort of common cultural moments that were much more the way we consumed media in the 20th century. In the 21st, everything is digital, everything is niche, everything is fragmented, and so those mass moments don't happen very often anymore. But two of these ads, were during moments where there would be a larger audience. So one of the F-150 ads, which was actually directed by Chloe Zhao, Oscar award-winning film director, was during the Tokyo Olympics. So thinking about those broadcasts, that I think it was in 2021. So it was before NBC had sort of figured out how to make it in the app and how to digitally distribute the Olympic Games via streaming. They were still sort of tied in some ways to the traditional broadcast moment. And so this ad, was positioned to get a larger audience because of like that media context intertextually of like when it's airing. And then one of the Impossible Burger was like during the Tonys, which is like a smaller mass audience, but is still a mass audience. So in that way, I thought the context sort of didn't resonate with some of what was in the ad, which was kind of funny. But the media, I think that was the piece that I found interesting of like trying to find those mass media moments when you're trying to tell these traditional narrativized stories about what a product is. So the F-150 ones in particular, like you kind of get wrapped up in them, like the way the music is incorporated in them. They have very traditional advertising voiceover that calls to our history, imagines an idea about the future, and it sells the product in a way that does kind of tug at you, even if you're a critical consumer. And so I find them really interesting in how they're constructed to get the most emotional and attention effect, even when they're simply circulating on YouTube and then had, these one sort of live moments as they were broadcast.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one thing that I thought was really interesting that was that, the logics of these commercials are basically individualized. It's like everyone purchase a car, everyone do this, but only the cars are only sort of for certain people, et cetera, et cetera. But they're trying to diversify that portfolio in different ways. So they're drawing on this idea of diversity and diversifying, and they're having this like blurred line between like who's involved and who's not through this gay window dressing stuff going on here, whether it's purposeful or not. It's just kind of meant to appeal to the most people as possible. But they're doing it in a situation where everyone's collectively watching one thing. So they need these situations of like collectivized, televised stuff, which happens in a more socialized manner to kind of like get people to individualistically buy stuff. And I thought that was like a really interesting sort of moment in which it's kind of like a form of kind of audience capture in different ways or something like this, where you don't see that in other spaces as well. Because now, we have more kind of like control over our ads in different ways, um, in really nefarious ways. Like our ads are chosen for us. Like when we're on Instagram and whatever it might be, as you know and have written about, sort of like you get. Like, and what I mean by that is like you get what you get because you're the one doing it. Like you're controlling your advertisement. So there's this weird sense of like control or something, but it's kind of not. It's kind of the other way around in many instances. Um, so I don't know. Those were kind of some thoughts about some of those things. Um, but there was also, I guess, more specific moments where, like, the Carl's Jr. advertising stuff, like, draws on the female body in many different ways to sell its product. So here you get the idea of sort of like women become the meat to consume, but also they're consuming the meat. So would you mind kind of like telling us a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think the idea of like the woman as a piece of meat, like, is definitely something that comes from Carol J. Adams. 1990, she publishes, The Sexual Politics of Meat, and it really lays out this way of theorizing how both women and animals are subordinated under patriarchy, and that animals are feminized and thus meant to be controlled, under the dominion of man. But then women, right, become pieces of meat. And so the provocative cover of her book is sort of a pinup style woman, but whose body is, being carved, the lines of, what the different cuts of meat would be as if it were, a cow or a sheep or, whatever, is being butchered to literally become something to consume. And so Carl's Jr., for most of the 21st century, had this ad where different supermodels, scantily clad, would bite into one of their big, gigantic burgers. And so, on the one hand, yes, we have this kind of transgressive representation of a woman eating a big, messy burger. Um, but it also, right, always immediately turns her into an object to be consumed by the male gaze as her body is put on display. But there were two ads that were really interesting. One of the big first ones, oh, now I'm forgetting the model's name. Paris Hilton is, cleaning her, sort of luxury vehicle, and it's the first of this series. It's earlier in the 21st century. It's so popular it literally crashes the Carl's Jr. website. It's in it's a completely different sort of internet infrastructure moment. But then that ad is sort of remade, 10, 15 years later with a different model, and she's with, a big truck. And so this idea of sort of a more Texas, representation of the body, the big belt buckle on the tiny bikini, and then the big truck as these sort of symbols that are all navigating this idea of something that men would want to consume, that those ads, interestingly though, to our discussions about, there was this moment where ads and brands were making these choices around diversity, around inclusion. And so Carl's Jr. stops these ads, not because they didn't think they were commercially successful, because they were, um, but they didn't make the choice because they wanted to be more feminist or to be more inclusive or to represent their brand genuinely in that kind of a way. Like it's just a business decision that like they were out of step in that particular moment, so they stopped it. And so once we get a second Trump presidency, those ads literally come back. So thinking about the broader contextual political environment that's setting gender norms and these expectations, they play out in our commercial environment of when brands take a stand, of when brands feel free to have misogynistic content again like this, that it's all a part of this package as well. And so these Carl's Jr. ads were a way to think again through the meaning making of meat, of burgers, of women's bodies, of animals, and then also how automobiles and trucks come in as these symbols that commingle within those advertising spaces.
Yeah, that's great. And that's kind of like one of my main questions is sort of like, is there a reason like why companies would choose to do sort of like more radical commercials or sort of like more radical products? Like, what is there a particular like incentive or, that's sort of tension, like, because if companies are trying to make money and they're not quite sure if these things would do that or undermine their profit margin, sort of what would make them want to do it? Like, is there a sort of incentive, or not, or that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think there's two things here. Like one is the pragmatic, like the fact that advertising is the industry that is the most direct handmaiden of capitalism, right? Like its job is to move product. It's always selling. Like that is what advertising does. But there's always this tension from the beginning of the rise of modern advertising in the 1920s that the people who go into advertising consider themselves the most modern of American citizens. And so they're interested, right, in who we're supposed to be, in what is forward thinking, in what the future might look like, and they want to shape it, right? Like there are people who, if they didn't go into advertising, thought they could write the great American novel or would have been interested, right, in other knowledge work kinds of fields. And so the moments that I've gotten to work directly with people working in the advertising industry or students who have been able to place into that industry, like they really do take these questions seriously. Like when you think about the skills of like a PhD researcher, if you can't get an academic job, like actually landing in an advertising agency where you get to do focus groups and interviews, to be able to surveil like what's going on in social media, what's going on in the news, and to bring all that context together to lend information of like how should we go about these campaigns. Like advertisers would say that they're always trying to push the envelope. They are the ones who care about these larger questions about what the world should be like, not just moving product, but that their job is to partner with a brand and a company, and that they're the ones who won't take the risk. They're the ones who are concerned with their bottom line, that the advertising agency is this interesting middle part of it where they do think they're creative, where they do think they have a politics that matter. And so I think that's why it was really interesting in thinking about our moment post George Floyd, where there was some political movement, but there was also so much advertising and commercial representation, right? So many brands made ads in those moments, trying to stand for something. But to your question, they did it at a moment where there was a fair amount of research that consumers, particularly younger ones, cared that brands had values and that they stood up for them. And it seems like that expectation is declining or less important or is too polarizing, right? That the views of what is values is too divergent for a brand to go one way or the other. You lose a segment of your potential consumer base by going one way or the other. So that's where we go back to something that doesn't have anything to do with politics or values. You're just making ads and products, or this subtle gay window dressing where it's like, how can we kind of message to both extremes and then still hit the middle, which is creatively a quite dissatisfying thing to work on. But I think is where a lot of brands find themselves as they're trying to navigate the moment that we're in now. but it's very, very different. 2020 to 2024, when I was teaching advertising, we had totally different ads to look at with my students. It's a completely different landscape when we look now of like, what are the messages? What are the stances? What are the politics being represented? It's very different than it was. It's very quiet now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thinking about the different kind of like social factions at play in creating these advertisements and who's doing it and why they're doing it, when they're doing it. Um, AI is also going to be part of this discussion, I'd
Ugh.
imagine, and probably already is. I don't know the
Yes.
field that
Yes.
well, but pretty soon, you're going to have the company is just there's no middleman. It's just simply like AI or whatever that might look like. Who knows really? Um, but it kind of this idea, reminds me of, like, the different whims of the political moment is, like, the BMW going from, like, Nazi to sort of gay to sort of, like, nothingness or whatever it might be. So there's definitely these tensions going on here because they're just trying to exist in many different ways, right? Like, I know during sort of it's June, so, like, during sort of gay pride, you're gonna get, like, some companies in their different online spaces for different countries are going to get rid of their gay flag stuff, right? LGBTQ flag, and other countries are going to have it, right? So it becomes a mandatory sort of thing. So these are something that I guess all these companies navigate in different kind of ways, based on so many different complicated factors. But it is pretty wild to think about the different advertising that occurred. Uh, that's really fascinating. But, before I let you go, is there anything you feel like we need to cover that we didn't cover? Any kind of remaining things you wanna say?
I think just the idea that our consumer culture is such a profound part of our everyday, of our common experience, of the things that we sometimes don't question. But these are just like the richest of texts, from ads to the packaging on the food that we eat, every single element of it, has something to say and is worth analyzing. And so that's why I spent so much time, like, not just trying to think about meat and then the alternative meat that comes after it, but thinking about it in this, parallel comparison of thinking about this world of trucks and cars and automobility and these dreams of like who we want to be, who this country wants to be, who we individually want to be. Um, and the fact that we're in a difficult moment, right? Like it's a wild time, like quite literally. And so consumer culture has been, whether it's, the balm of the masses or it's escapism or being able to afford something feels like the sacrifices are worth it. Like it's an interesting space to be able to navigate and follow and try and understand these things. And so I think that's why I was so interested in the ambivalence of what stories could advertising tell? What futures could it imagine? And of course, that wouldn't change everything, but it would make the image of it exist in a world that it currently doesn't. And so I'm just disappointed that advertisers are becoming so very risk adverse and not telling these stories. Because yes, it's a field dominated by data analytics and very much about moving product and all of this niche target marketing that we've been talking about that's quite different. But it also tells stories. It's also creative culture. It's also where some really interesting people like try to put their brains and their minds to work. And so even as advertising, sort of fades in some ways, I believe sort of the idea that when everything becomes an ad, when everything is promotional. So we might not have traditional TV commercials anymore, but almost everything in our culture is an ad. And if it is the language of our consumer culture, which has become the dominant discourse of who we are and what we're becoming, it's the space where we figure out how all this is happening and how we might ever get somewhere different.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's very much the sort of society of spectacle where everything is a consumable advertisement to then reproduce. So that's great. Thank you so much for stating all of those things. It was a pleasure getting to talk to you, and it was really fun reading your article. And if you want to say anything about future upcoming work, that would be great. And I hope we stay in touch.
No, I'd love it. Anyone who wants to, emilycontois.com is where I share a lot of my work. And Instagram, as a mess of it is, like that's where I am as well. So for little bits of the research, the podcasts I'm on, the media mentions, like would love to connect with people there.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And we'll be in touch.
Sounds good.
So